Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of the Refold Roundtable Podcast, the podcast where we talk about all things language learning. And today we are going to be talking about internalizing your target language. Is it possible to internalize your target language as much as your native language? Well, we're going to talk about that and we're going to find out what our thoughts are. I am accompanied by the usual suspects. I am Bree, the community manager for Refold, and I do Twitter things and make memes. We have George and Shiki. George, you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
I am George. I'm the community manager. Bree is the social media manager.
What did I say? Did I say did I
You
say
said
community
community
manager?
manager. That's
I'm
okay. I'll
coming
let it
for
slide
you.
this time.
I'm coming for
And
you.
I like languages.
You like languages.
I do.
Perfect. And Shiki, introduce
Hello,
yourself.
I am Shiki. I am one of the language coaches at Refold, Japanese learner, stage 2C. You know.
I know. Good. And today we have a special treat for you. We have Ethan, aka Tops Down, aka CEO of Refold, here with us. Ethan, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yo, what up? It's your boy. Yeah, I guess most people know who I am at this point, but Spanish learner, somewhere mid 3C, running Refold day to day, and thankful to all the members here on my team for doing this awesome podcast.
Thank you. I'm excited about this topic, y'all.
Yeah. What is our topic
Like,
for today?
the topic is internalizing your target language, and if it's possible to internalize it as much as your native language, and I guess all things surrounding that topic. So, if it is possible, how do you do that? What's our experience with that? So,
So I want to hand
yeah.
this over to Ethan. I feel like Ethan has some really strong feelings on this.
I have strong feelings about everything. But I think it would be more interesting if we sort of went around the room and did like a yes no, just to
Okay.
see where everybody's at right now, and then we can do it at the end and see what we learned.
Okay. So, do I think it's possible? I think it could be possible. I don't think it's impossible, but I also think it depends on how far you get and how you're learning.
I definitely think it's possible. I don't think it's necessarily the norm or the most common thing, but you definitely see it with immigrants or long-term expats, and I also think you see it with heritage speakers. You know, if you grow up speaking Spanish at home, but then all of your friends speak English, and you learn English in school whenever you start 5 or 6 years old. I definitely think that there are special circumstances where you can internalize it as well as your L1 as your native language, but I don't know if it's the norm.
I think it's possible. It's just a matter of willingness.
So I want to be the contrarian here. Specifically, internalizing it as well as your native language, I actually do not think is possible. But I do think that you can definitely internalize it and you can get a level of comfort with it and a level of instinct with it. And that sort of gets to my next question, which is what does it mean to internalize a language?
Yeah, that's big. I mean, to me, it's when I'm able to read something and I'm not thinking about the fact that I'm reading a different language, right? So, like if I'm reading or listening to something and it just is as clear in my mind as it would be in English, and I forget that I'm not listening to a language that's not my native language, I feel like to me that's somewhat internalizing. But to go even deeper, I feel like that would not just be like input. I feel like that would also have to apply to output as well.
Yeah, I think of it in that deeper way where it's like you're not just understanding like at the same level as your native language, but you're also internalizing it to the point that it comes out in your personality. Like you have a whole different identity as a person in the target language, or maybe the same as your native language, but you have like those established identities.
George, you want to go?
Yeah, I definitely think that speaker identity has a part to play in sort of internalizing your target language. Um, and I guess I don't know. There was a story, and I'm pretty sure it's an actual story. It's not like a tall tale, where the way they tell spies when they train them in a foreign language is to they test them on things that the spy probably has never talked about before, and you can usually see their mental model of their L2 break down. So, for example, you can be a very, very advanced speaker of, say, English, but if I quizzed you on something like, I don't know, molecular engineering or something, and that you know nothing about, you're going to break down if you're an L2 speaker, whereas an L1 speaker would still maybe not know all of the terms, but they would cope with it better. And this applies to very, very advanced speakers. Actually, I really want to find the things that I'm referring to, the studies, and share them with everybody after the podcast, maybe on the YouTube channel, because it's really interesting. Because actually, I initially answered, yeah, of course you can. You can internalize it just as much as your L1, but Ethan got me thinking, you know what? Maybe you can't. Maybe I'm wrong.
That reminds
Yeah.
me of a video that I saw. Um, like it was one of those videos on the YouTube channel Wired where it's like a former spy breaks down spy movies, and it had the example of someone, I think it was Russian or some European language, where someone was a spy and learned Russian to a very, very, very high level to where they were undetectable in the country they were in. But as soon as they were asked to count something, like show their fingers to count something, like in America, you use your
Yeah.
pointer fingers, but in European countries, you use the thumb and then the other fingers. So he was called out
In
from
in
that.
Southeast Asia, you start counting with your pinky. So you would hold up your pinky finger first, then your ring finger, then your middle finger to count to 3, so on and so forth. So
Mhm.
That's
So that's
hard. I'm
how he
finding that
was.
right
Pretty
now.
sure
was
the
clocked.
movie in question is Inglorious Bastards.
I'm not sure,
Is
but
it?
it reminded me of
the
that.
Yeah.
Buongiorno one.
Yeah, no, but there's a scene where the British spy is speaking German, and he's discovered because he holds up the number 3 wrong.
Oh. I thought you were
So
talking about the other guy who was just speaking awful Italian and making a joke, but I forgot about that scene.
no, I was being very serious. Yeah, no, I think that might have been the movie that he was breaking down.
All right, we're gonna have to Google
So
it.
on
I
my end,
promise.
I keep going back to this one study that I've seen repeatedly, which demonstrated, I believe it was they did MRIs on multilingual folks, and the people who had learned multiple languages in their infancy or in their childhood, they actually stored their both of those languages in the same part of their brain. But people who had learned languages later on in adulthood actually stored that in other parts of their brain. Um, so that, in my mind, that makes it reasonably clear that there's a distinction between the languages that you acquire as a child versus the ones that you acquire as an adult. And I don't know if that means that you can't internalize it in the same way, but it seems like you don't end up internalizing it in exactly the same way. And so that's
Sure.
my inclination to think that, okay, it's not exactly possible to really embed the language, the second language, as well as your first language, just because your brain as an adult works very differently and the information is stored differently than it is in your native language.
I think that you probably can't get all the way to native level, right? But I guess the question is then, if you can't get all the way, how close can you get?
And I think coming back to this question of the what does it mean to internalize the language? What you
Yeah.
said around having the language fade away, fade into the background so that you're interacting with it. That's clearly
Yeah.
possible because people do it all the time in our community, right?
Right.
So that level of internalizing is 100% possible. People do it all the time. I went through that transition. I remember going through that transition and being like, oh, I am suddenly interacting with this content through the language rather than having the language be an obstacle. Um, but I don't feel like Spanish is embedded in me anywhere near as much as English is. Like in moments of panic, or like in moments of an
Yes.
emergency, I don't think that I would ever go to Spanish, even no matter how long that I live in a Spanish speaking country or like I speak Spanish
Yeah.
on a regular basis. I feel like there's always the sort of primal lizard brain attachment
Yes.
to the native language.
I
That happened to
Where
definitely
me. That
I
happened to me. I had
definitely
an
curse in
emergency.
English.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a lot more cathartic to curse in English, but I've had that happen to me where I've had an emergency and I was quite comfortable Googling things in Spanish and my computer was set to Spanish, but something happened with my kid and I had to Google something and suddenly I couldn't understand a lick of it and it was terrifying. And after that, I actually don't have my browser set to Spanish anymore because like if anything ever happened and that lizard brain kicked in, I want to make sure that I understand it like in the blink of an eye. But like in cases where it's not an emergency, I feel like I've been able to not internalize it to a super high degree, but I've gotten to points where I can read something or I can listen to something and I totally like we talked about earlier, like the language like fades away into the background. For people that maybe haven't experienced that, what do you think is a good way to like describe what internalizing it to that degree might feel like?
Like getting into a flow state, I guess, where it sounds cliche, and I don't think it's quite true. But the example you get is, "Oh, I forgot I was reading in Spanish," or "I forgot I was
Yeah.
listening to Spanish." I don't think that's quite true, but I do think there's a point where it doesn't feel foreign, and it doesn't require that much additional effort to understand what you are taking in. So whether it be listening or reading.
Yeah, I'd agree
Um,
with that.
and I think a good way to sort of trick yourself, especially early on in the process, for your first sort of eureka moment, is to choose something really easy. And I don't mean like a kid's book. I mean like the example I often give is Hola Lola, which is a graded reader for Spanish. It's A1. It's all in the present tense. It's very simple, and I had come to it after a few years of having learned Spanish. It was just so simple. It didn't feel like I was exerting any additional effort. And I think it's a good way when something is totally comprehensible beyond the shadow of a doubt, you can enter the flow state in your target language the same way you would with your L1.
I think
Yeah,
on my
Elo
end,
Lolo was the same. Oh, go ahead.
yeah, no, I think on my end, what does it feel like? I remember, it was about 2 years ago now. I remember this distinct moment where I was like listening to Harry Potter, and I still had this habit of translating in my head, where I would hear something, and I wouldn't like fully understand it, and then I would just by nature like try and translate it. And in the translation process, I might be able to translate it and then understand it, but I would miss 30 seconds of audio while that was happening. And so at a certain point, I had to make a decision of like, okay, I'm not going to translate in my head anymore. I'm just gonna, kill that mental process and just listen and be okay with just listening and not worry about really trying to put my understanding into words. Um, and after that, uh, it definitely triggered something in my head where nowadays when I hear something in Spanish, I will understand it fully, but I will not be able to immediately put it into words. Like I would actually have to think about, okay, how would I actually say this, or like how would I put this in English? What does this actually mean if I were to like write it down? And I feel like that is sort of the indication of really internalizing it, where Matt has talked about this concept of mentalese before, where you are listening to something and it's being converted into pure thought. And I see that sort of as the example of what that process looks like. And I think in his video about that, he talks about how like he has this idea in his head and he doesn't know how to put it in Japanese, but he also doesn't know how to put it in English. And so it's like separate and distinct from the specific words. And I've definitely had a lot of those moments where I understand something fully, but the process of putting it back into words is a challenge, especially if I'm trying to translate it into English where there's no direct equivalent.
I've actually noticed this about myself recently because um, walking around school, I realized that I'm just wasting all this time, like, and I could be filling it with something. So I'm listening to like podcasts in Japanese while I walk around school because I spend a few hours at school every day. And I had a realization one day I was listening and um, I realized I understood what was going on, but like I had to consciously think about how I would translate it into English. But like, I don't know, I was just feeling the vibes and I couldn't like put it into words.
Yeah, so it's just vibing with the language, not putting
Yeah.
it into the words.
Yeah.
Going
Internalizing it is vibing with it.
Yeah.
going back to what Ethan said, he said two things. The first one is it's hard to put it into words, especially if you're going from your target language to your native language, right? Like English, like you can understand it. But and I've seen this myself when I give informal translation to a new learner of like say Filipino or something, where it's really hard to make it sound organic in English, even if you know what it means pretty well
Yeah.
in your target language.
Yeah, because there's what it's saying and then there's what it means, which can be totally different.
And then there's,
And I
how you would put it or how you would naturally phrase it in the other language.
exactly. Yeah, exactly. I have the same problem. I bought these storybooks in Spanish to read to my child, and she's not at the place yet where she can listen to stories and understand what's going on. So my goal was to read them to her in English, and I thought, these are just kid stories. I can translate as I go, no problem. And it is hard. Like, I understand the story, no problem. But like you said, like trying to put it into English and make it a story that makes sense and is interesting, um, is very difficult. And yeah, like it's when you have that picture of what something means or like what the vibe of what you're reading is, and you're not able to say it in English, I feel like that could be a really good indication of like internalizing the language. But what are some other ways? Like, do you think that there are different degrees? Like, you can have it fully internalized one way and not in another way. Um, like, what types of internalization do you think there are?
I mean, I think the obvious uh, one is input versus output, right?
Right.
So internalizing something from an input side, from an understanding side, um, is it's always feelings that we're describing, but from an output side, um, I just remember when I was like in high school and I would like watch the same movie over and over again, or I'd watch the same like comedy routine over and over again, and
Mm.
or I'd have the same phrases with my friends over and over again, and they come to they honestly they come to your mouth before they come to your mind, where it's just so natural to say the thing that it
Yes.
completely bypasses any thought. And I feel like
Right.
if we were to measure sort of the what internalization looks at the output side, I think that's the goal that we're trying to attain.
Where your mouth moves before your brain does.
And
Yeah.
it's very interesting with sort of like interjections or swearing, because I think you'll give yourself away. So, for example, things like ow or ouch are actually not universal, or the sound that you make when you're sneezing is not universal. So, like,
What?
um,
The sound you
they're
make when
not
you sneeze?
right. Like when people are like, chew, like they really like when they like that's how my
There's so
dad
many
used to
different
do it.
sneezes. Oh my god, you could look up on
Um,
YouTube the number of different sneezes. They're crazy.
yeah, there's a lot of different sneezes, even words like saying ow or ouch. You would think when you pinch your hand in like a drawer, you're gonna say ah or ow, but not everyone does. Filipinos say aray. Indonesians and Malaysians say aduh or adoy. So like Americans, we say ow or ouch. And a lot of these things will give you away. And I wonder, does that apply to internalizing your target language? Or is that separate? Are these introductions and sort of swears and cursing, are they separate from language? Do they bypass that?
I think it's a part of it. It's like part of your whole like persona situation, your identity.
Right? Because like
I mean, that
Japanese
might even
people say
go.
itai, right? Like ite, tit, tit,
Mm.
tit.
I mean, if you think it's
I'm
sort of
still
like
stuck on the
animals,
sneezes,
right?
to be honest.
Animals often have like their own sounds that they make in different situations that are like very specific to them. That I do think is completely separate from what we would consider language, but it is communication in some capacity, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Would that be like internalizing the culture? Is that like a different thing? No, I think that's more like innate. Like you talked earlier, like your lizard brain like kicking in times of crisis or emergency. Like you can't really control what comes out.
Yeah, I guess it's like different levels of it. Like if you get to a point where you start saying things in your target language in those kinds of situations, I think you're like hyper giga chad level in your target language.
You
But
could
I
probably
wonder
get to
if
a point though where those things are, natural. Like if you say that with your family, like let's say that you move to your target country and you have a family in your target country and you communicate all day and the way that you interact with the people around you are by saying those things, I think that you could probably like kind of substitute that for what you grew up with.
Right, but Ethan mentioned earlier a study where we like kind of store things in different parts of our brain.
Sure.
So the question
Sure.
is it really internalizing or is it
Sure. I mean, the
communication?
question was like, would that come out naturally? Like if that happened. I think it could come out naturally, but maybe, like you said, it wouldn't be from the same part of your brain and maybe not completely natural. But Tops, I heard you had something to say.
I just want to add on this. One thing that I am skeptical about with that study is I actually don't know like who they chose for it. I've not done like a full reading of the entire research paper, so like I don't know if they chose people who are at a super duper high level in their second language, or if they use traditional versus immersion learning. If they've done like massive input before, so it's entirely possible that their sub selection of people that they measured were very focused on traditional skill based learning, and that's why it's stored in another part of the brain. Or they were, intermediate versus very high advanced. So I think we would probably need to do some much more study to really understand whether, eventually it does merge into the same part of the brain. And then there's the separate question of like it's whether the fact that it's in a different part of the brain matters, or whether the results might be exactly the same even though they're in different parts of the brain. And I don't know enough about neuroscience to really talk with any sort of authority on the matter. I would love to speak to a neuroscience scientist about that to see what their opinions were.
Yeah, so one thing I did want to bring up for this topic was did your L2 affect your L1 in any way?
Like degrade it.
I don't mean to grade it, but like I'll give you an example. Filipinos don't say turn on the light or turn off the light. They say open the light or close the light. Um, and you'll often hear English speakers from the Philippines say, open the light. Um, and after a while, it just sounds acceptable, after you hear open the light, open the light, open the light. I don't think I would bat my eyes if I heard someone say open the light. And yeah, I'm wondering if there are any effects of having internalized your L2 or maybe even another dialect or variety of your L1, if it affects your native sort of basal language.
I accidentally drop pronouns all the time because of Spanish. And I don't think I did that before I started learning Spanish.
I think I did. I'm just inconsiderate.
I notice myself writing and I'll get a squiggly line and Grammarly will be mad at me and I'll just be like, "What? What did I do? This is a fine." Oh, no. There's no there's no pronoun at the front.
There's no
And
subject
it's
in your sentence.
there's nothing going on, right? And it's pretty funny. So I drop those. I don't think really anything else though. I think that's really the main thing for me. I'm also not at a super high advanced level. I'm just a mere 3A on the Refold roadmap. um, but I don't think it's totally impacted me. I will have some times where I just get lost for words and I can't think of the word in either language. And I get to have that really fun moment where I go, "Oh, how do you say this in English?" and sound really smart. But that's about that's about all I get. I get some cool factor and missing subjects of my sentence.
Yeah, I don't know if I've had any examples like you're describing, George. I have heard other people have those kinds of examples. You'll hear stories like that on Twitter all the time in the polyglot community. For me, the only thing that's sort of equivalent was when I came back from South America, my English had degraded because I hadn't been speaking like high level, intelligent, college level English for 6 months. And so I came back and there were like a whole bunch of words that were all like right on the tip of my tongue and I just couldn't remember what they were. I think just from lack of use. But in terms of sort of transferring uh, grammatical concepts or idioms or whatnot from uh, target language to native language, there are definitely times when I like think of something to say and it's a direct translation of Spanish. And I'm like, nope, that's not right. I'm trying to speak English right now. But I haven't done it. I don't think it's ever actually like popped out of my mouth. It's just like, oh, that came to mind.
Yeah, so I think you see this a lot in the Spanish American community, um, where people might say like someone from say Puerto Rico or some like a Spanish speaker who lives in New York might use the word actualmente the way that we use it in English, right? Where they're saying actually, but
Mhm.
that's not the way it would be used in other Spanish-speaking countries. Or
Puerto
um,
Rico is sort of an exception. They like half the words they use are English.
yeah, but I definitely think that you can sort of have this sort of semantic, I don't know, cross contamination where
Sure.
very clearly they're related words, and over time, the sort of barrier between them breaks down if they're stored the same.
Sure.
So like I've heard weird things, like I've heard of like New Yorkers, Puerto Ricans who grew up in New York saying like using ordenar instead of pedir to order food and like other things. And I don't know if that's like a weird heritage speaker thing or if it's like their English has affected their Spanish. I'm not really sure what's going on because, like you said, being a Puerto Rican is a bit of a special case of language contact. But I feel like it's
Yeah, I
more
was
common than it sounds like a bad polyglot myth, but I think it's true. I think it's real.
Yeah. I mean, specifically with Puerto Ricans, when I was in Puerto Rico a few months ago, I was talking to a college professor, and she was saying that, like, with her students, um, she has actually had to do like remedial Spanish for some of her students because they literally cannot talk without injecting English into their sentences. Um, like, they cannot speak pure Spanish, it's all Spanglish.
And I have seen that
And
in the Refold community. There are a couple of active Puerto Ricans in the community. People who live in Puerto Rico. They don't even live in like the United States proper, who
Mhm.
definitely cannot help but Spanglish.
Yeah, I think it's just so part of their day-to-day language, that it's as natural as it would be for, someone from Colombia to just speak Colombian Spanish.
So then I would argue that intense language contact with an L2 can affect your L1.
Sure, I don't have any uh I don't know, gripes with that. Is
Another
gripe
thing
the
that
right
I've,
word?
yeah, I think gripe is the right word. Another thing that I've
Mhm.
heard is that people who speak more than one language often prefer words that are cognate between the language, even if you wouldn't usually say it that way. Something like, I don't know, enter sounds very formal to an English speaker versus, hey, come in. But somebody who speaks Spanish, where they don't like phrasal verbs and they would use like entrar or something, may find it more readily the words that are shared between the languages.
I definitely run into this all the time in my Spanish tutor classes where I'll use a word that is a cognate, or I'll use a word that is um what my tutor would consider sort of like an SAT level word, where it's like an advanced word that people generally wouldn't know, but it's a direct meaning. I definitely struggle to use. I know that they're not technically phrasal verbs in Spanish, but um, the more like multi-word expressions that express the same meaning, because I feel like um, when you look at colloquial speech and common speech, people tend to use multi-word expressions to represent more advanced ideas, and there might be a word that represents that advanced idea anyway, but very few people actually use it.
Yeah, I would agree. And I'm trying to remember. So I shared with the other Refold sort of team members once upon a time a study that showed, and I feel like it was, I don't know, Dutch and English speakers. And I can't remember the exact details of the study, but it showed that people parsed words better that were the same in both languages. was the takeaway from the paper. So, for example, drink is the same in English and Dutch, right? It's literally the same word. And I think there's some truth to that. I think that you do get a preference for cognates, even if they're less common among monolinguals or they're a little bit more obscure.
You see it all the
Are
time
you
in Spanish
talking
when
as
people say
that affecting
comprender.
your Are you talking about
Yeah,
that
affecting
affecting
your
your
L1.
L2 or
No,
your
affecting
see, I
your
don't
native language. Like,
see, I
so,
don't find that affecting my native language as much as that is affecting my target language. Like I definitely gravitate to cognates in Spanish, but I don't think I've had that although I'm not at a high speaking level, so maybe that will change, but the more that I output and the more that I read, I don't notice that changing the way that I speak in English as far as the words that I'm choosing. I feel like I'm still speaking the same way, but that's just my personal experience.
I just think it has to do with the amount of time in the day that you're speaking each language.
Right.
Right. Like, my experience with sort of seeing my English degrade, that was because I was speaking Spanish for most of the day, all day for 6 months. Um, if I were only doing an hour of Spanish and the rest of my day was in English, like now, I don't anticipate that happening. I think it only happens if you're spending your whole day in that language.
Did it change to like when you were away for 6 months when you came back, did it change your word choice? Like, did you gravitate to cognates that were in both languages when you were speaking English too?
I didn't notice that in my speech.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not saying it wouldn't be possible or that I'm disagreeing with
Sure,
what George is
sure.
saying, but I just didn't personally experience it.
That's interesting.
It's interesting. I definitely think things start to sound more normal or acceptable after a while.
I would definitely agree with that.
Yeah, I'm always tickled. A little off topic. I'm always tickled at how if you're learning a language like Spanish that does share a lot of SAT level vocab with English, a lot of times your dictionary will just give you that word and expect you to know. The other day, I was reading Spanish and I saw the word perdición or something, which I
Hmm.
guess it means like doom or damnation. And it's like, oh yeah, this means perdition in English. And I'm like, well, I know perdition. I've heard it. I know it's a word, but I
It's a
didn't know.
movie.
Well,
The
Oh, it's a
perdition,
perdition.
I was thinking that, yeah.
yeah, well, I didn't know the meaning of perdition. I knew it meant something bad and that it was a
I'm pretty
word
sure it's like perder, which is like to lose
to
yourself.
lose. Yeah, and this happens a lot, I think, with languages that do share a lot of like, loan words or fancy vocab and yeah, just something to note where this sort of thing happens and even dictionaries are bad about it, where they give you the synonym instead of giving you or so they give you the cognate word rather than giving you a more common word like doom.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I've noticed that as well. There's definitely been times when I look things up and it's like, oh, what's this word? Look it up. The dictionary definition, exactly the same word. I'm like, I still don't know what this word is.
I hate that. And then I have to look it up in English and figure out what
Yeah.
it means.
It's like, do I speak English?
No, apparently not. At
Like
least
a
not college
remit.
level.
That was a word. That
Oh,
was an English word that I learned through Spanish.
I know how to use it.
Remit.
I would be remit. I would be remit if I didn't do this, but I couldn't tell
No,
you
no,
what
that's
remit
remiss.
meant.
That's
Remiss? Oh gosh,
remiss.
then I don't know
Yep.
what
Remit
it
is like to
means.
send something usually.
Yep.
Like they talk about
Remit?
remittances. Yeah, so if you're ever
Remittances?
in Latin America or
What
Southeast
language
Asia,
is this?
well, so for example, if you ever like, if you've ever been at like, I don't know, like a store in America where they have like a Western Union inside, you might see a lot
I'm
of
gonna Google. I'm not
people
Googling
like
anything.
remitting money, like workers might be
Remit?
sending stuff back to like Latin America.
Side
Um,
note, new startup that actually has been popping up all over my ads is Remitly, to send
Remitly?
to Remitly to
right.
send money to Latin America. So
So like again, like you're a native speaker, Bree, you didn't know the word remit, but it's there. It's just I guess it's
It's a
also a
native mistake,
cognate.
okay? It's a native mistake, so it's
Native
all fine.
mistake.
It's a native
It's
mistake.
back.
But yeah, so when it comes to like internalizing your target language, what exactly do we mean? I think we didn't fully define that at the start of the episode, and I'd like to maybe
Yeah,
try and define it now.
it's kinda hard to define. How would you define it, George? Gorg.
So we kind of touched on this earlier, where like, Ethan said that he can understand very fluidly, but then when it goes to saying what he wants to say or translating what he hears, it's not automatic. So it makes me wonder if, and again, I'm without a study, this is all just speculation. And it makes me wonder if there are different levels of internalizing things where you can maybe fully understand Japanese if all you do is read light novels for 8 hours a day. Um, but maybe you could not output it. Is that still internalizing? Should we subdivide internalizing your language into like reading, listening, writing, and speaking? What exactly is internalization? Because I'm not really sure. I have an idea of what it means. Like it feels internal, it feels automatic. When I see over on the Tagalog server a new learner, I can say, oh yeah, they're speaking broken Tagalog. I can tell it's broken. Is that internalizing the language? I'm not sure.
Like effortless? Like if things are effortless?
Effortless. I feel like maybe what we want to say is having a good mental model of the language. Is that what we're talking about?
I
Maybe.
think it goes beyond that. I
I
do
think like
think
you
that
said earlier, Tops, like when your mouth moves before your brain does. When it's
yeah,
just it
it
just
goes
happens.
beyond effortlessness because effortlessness is like you're still trying to do something. It's just super easy. Um, but there's a level with language that feels like you literally do not have to think at all. And I sort of go back to so I did musical theater for a long time, and when you're doing theater, you're repeating the same lines over and over and over again. And what does it mean to like internalize that dialogue? Like you really have to feel and understand that dialogue such that when it comes out of your mouth, it is A, automatic, but B,
Mhm.
so tied into like what you're feeling and or what you're trying to portray that it doesn't there's no friction
Mm.
and that it sort of spills out of you without any sort of thought or effort or it's just really tied into who you are. And I think that's sort of like right now when I'm talking, I'm pausing constantly because I'm trying to like think of what I want to say. So it's almost like there's a level of internalization that I don't have with my own understanding of this topic or my own thoughts that I'm trying to express. Um, Whereas when I think of like what a truly internalized experience with language would be, it's that automatic response that you just like spit out without having any sort of mental effort or thinking going towards it. Um, and so it's that those automatic phrases, and that's why I actually wonder if repetition in output, our learning scripts would actually be helpful at a certain point. Not because you want to actually use those constantly in your speech, because then it would sound automatic and packaged or prepackaged, but just to have something that is um, so natural to you that you don't have to think about it. And it's something that I've been thinking about for a while of whether that would actually be a useful thing, because that's something that we currently don't encourage. In fact, we actively discourage it in the roadmap. Is a lot of repetition until internalizing that piece of media or that piece of output to a level that is completely and totally automatic. And I wonder if that is something that we should not shy away from or not discourage as much as we do.
Mm. I for one, I really like re-listening and rewatching things because it makes the process of understanding it that much more effortless or automatic. Like I'm not even trying to think about it. It's just familiar. I'm already in the headspace and the language is very easy and I don't feel that friction like you talked about. And as far as output is concerned, I could see that. I mean, I'm not an expert on this, but I mean, I could see that being helpful if you practice saying the same things over and over again, or maybe if you practice shadowing the same piece of content over and over again. I could see that making that muscle memory, that delivery a lot easier. And it's something I'd be willing to try and report back once I get to that point.
Yeah, that actually sparked
But
my memory of the interview that Matt did with Xiaoma about how he learned Mandarin. where like anytime he came across something that he wanted to say but didn't have immediately accessible to him, he made an output Anki card for it, and he
Oh,
used that as a way to just um, constantly like repeat that phrase until it was so ingrained in his I don't know, his memory or his personality that it came automatic and naturally.
I definitely think there's room for output cards at some point, and it's something that in the last episode of the podcast that Cole kind of touched on, which is like taking the automaticity that you can build from like doing drills in a classroom environment and bringing them to the 21st century with Anki. Um, and I definitely think that you definitely need to practice automaticity, either through living in the country or being around speakers and having those automatic responses. But I'm not sure it translates to a good internal model of the language because, like, you can train a parrot to give you the right response, but that doesn't mean they fully grok the response that they're giving.
Sure, I think I would make the distinction between that automaticity for input versus the automaticity for output.
Yeah, I think automaticity for output is much more of a skill, maybe like a trained thing. A little bit less, I don't know, a different level.
I mean, like you said, George, I think that you would have to. I mean, I think we all are here because we agree that input is definitely important in the early stages, and that's what you should be focusing on. But I think that's what builds your mental model is the input that you get. But actually, activating that mental model and the ability to use it is different. The ability to recall what you know is a totally different skill.
Yeah, recognition is one thing. The example I always give is sandcastles. If you're at the beach and you're an alien and you see a sandcastle for the first time, you'll have no clue what it is. But then when someone tells you, hey, it's a castle, which is like a fort made out of sand, which is like, I don't know, ground up glass. What is sand? I don't know. That's a different topic. And someone says, this is a sandcastle. This is what a castle is. This is what sand is. Great. Now, if you tell that same alien to go and build a sandcastle, he may not do a good job, from just seeing a sandcastle one time. And I would argue that even seeing a sandcastle 1,000 times over does not mean you're going to know how to build a sandcastle.
Facts, because I cannot make a good sandcastle to save my life. So
Yeah, I see it all the
that's
time.
proof.
I've got some construction going on by my house, and every time I walk by, I'm like, okay, that's like a rafter. That's definitely cement. That's definitely like rebar inside the cement sticking out. But I don't think I could actually build a building just from watching people build it. I definitely think I would need to actually get my boots on the ground and go build the building to understand how construction works.
I think this is why uh, chorusing is such a good transition to output because it allows you to start exercising that muscle of getting the thoughts to your mouth and rehearsing things that are kind of just passive at the moment.
What we're all saying is that you should do output from day one and screw input.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Evil
We're
Totally.
Refold be
changing
like,
If you
evil
don't like,
refold.
just redefine what a sandcastle is if yours doesn't look great.
There you go.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
This
totally.
mound of sand is my castle.
No, I do think that like waiting, like not that like you should be scared of talking or anything, but I think that waiting until you understand what's going on is probably, a good idea as far as making what you say make sense. Because like, was it you who said that earlier, George? Where like you can say or you can be a parrot and you can repeat things, but that doesn't mean that you understand what you're saying.
Yeah, for sure.
I think that having a really strong recognition model, as you said, is really important when you want to have a good output model because there's no point if you can't understand it.
I just want to make the audience make it clear that I was being sarcastic. if
No,
that
it's
if that was
true.
not clear, I was being
We're
very sarcastic.
outputting from the very beginning. Refold is changing right now. It's a new day. It's a new
Incomprehensible
Refold.
Incomprehensible output
outfold.
is the future.
Refold gets canceled. No.
Incomprehensible output.
Incomprehensible output is our new model.
Incomprehensible output.
Oh, I already got that.
Didn't Matt say, sorry to like change the topic a little bit, but didn't Matt say in one of his videos, I can't remember if it was him or not, that like speaking in Japanese, like it was very natural to him, but it still felt like he had like gloves on. And then like if he consumed like the same piece in English, it was like experience it with like the gloves off. And I very much feel that. Like I can read
can
something
agree
in
with that.
Spanish. I can read something in Spanish that I'm so familiar with, like El Bestiario, and I'm re-listening to it right now. But if I was to like reread a passage in English, that's not a good example because there's no English translation, but just roll with me. It hits me different. Like it hits different, even though I completely understood the Spanish. There's just something about the native words that are just so innate in my being that I think it would be very difficult to completely replace that same feeling with Spanish, no matter how much I
There's a
understood it.
Nelson Mandela quote that says something like, if you talk to a man in a language he understands, it goes to his head. But if you talk to him in his own language, it goes to his heart. And I definitely buy that.
Yeah, there's
Except it's like,
an aspect of especially when like trying to translate something for a friend or explain something to a friend. I was doing it in a group chat today, where it's just like, yeah, I can explain what this means, but it really loses something in translation. And like I can't even put my finger on what exactly it loses, but there's like just like a feeling that comes from this phrase or
yes.
from this sentence that I cannot put into English words.
Japanese has entered the chat.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm with you. Do you have the same feeling in Tagalog? Because you're very, very, very proficient in it. You undersell your abilities all the time, but I mean, like you live your life
Yes.
in that language. Do you find yourself like if you read something in Tagalog and you listen to it in English, it just hits different in English, even though you are super high level?
I don't think I've ever had the privilege of having something translated.
Mm.
Um,
Yeah.
because believe it or not, translations are just not a thing. If you have a population who can mostly speak English, then why do a second localization, maybe? So um,
I guess that
that's a
makes
good
sense. Yeah.
question. That's a good question. But I don't know. There are definitely like there are different layers. There's like this really poetic Filipino that is devoid of Spanish and English loans that feels very foreign to me. But I feel like the daily language is very natural and organic. But I definitely can relate to having gloves on. Um, I think I often sound wordy when I speak Filipino because there's often at times a better way to say it that's more concise.
Yeah,
And
I do
I
this
get
all the
my
time in
point.
Spanish.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
get my point across, and my grammar's fine, but it's just clunky. Um, so I definitely feel the frustrations of like, this is not the real sensation. I'm wearing a glove when it comes to outputting in your L2. Um,
Yeah, there's so many times when I'm listening to Spanish and they'll say something and they'll drop like half the words. It'll be like a sentence fragment. I'll know exactly what they mean, but I'm like, oh, I would just never think to drop half those words. Like I would phrase that as like this very long sentence, but they managed to sum it up in these like three words and in a complete sentence fragment that is missing all sorts of words that I would inject into it.
yeah, and I've seen that with refolders actually in the refold community. One of our Japanese admins, his handle is Sin. He would read like 8 hours a day, and he did this for like 2 years, and he got pretty okay at understanding Japanese. But it wasn't until he started outputting for an hour a day that he was able to cut his responses down from paragraphs to simple sentence fragments. Um, and I don't know, that's a whole other, I don't know, can of worms.
Yeah.
Sounding, you can be grammatical and you can be understood, and it can even be kind of fairly natural, but it won't be concise, I think. And that's
Yeah.
definitely your frustration. And Mr. Salas in his book, actually, he had some really good examples. He wrote a book from zero to polyglot in Spanish. If you're a Spanish learner, check it out. It's pretty easy read. Uh, he gave like 4 examples of like being like a beginner in a language. Like, do you like pizza? Oh yeah, I like pizza. Do you like pizza? Oh yeah, of course I like pizza. It's my favorite food. And it progressively got more and more detailed. And I don't know. I definitely personally do not feel like I've internalized Filipino to the same level as my English. It doesn't feel totally organic. It doesn't feel totally natural and concise. And I think most of us feel that way with our L2s right now. But that doesn't mean like it can't happen. You know, if I only spoke German and then I moved to America and only spoke English for like 50 years, maybe. I don't know.
I mean, that's sort of the question. Like, have you, living in the Philippines, been, have you completely 100% ever immersed yourself in Tagalog so that it was the only language that you interacted with on a day-to-day basis for an extended period of time?
It's hard to say because for some countries like the Philippines, India, Paraguay, they're so multilingual. It's hard for that to happen. Even Filipinos don't fully immerse in Tagalog, I think, unless they're in a Tagalog-speaking province. So to clarify, uh, Tagalog Filipino is only spoken natively by 30% of Filipinos. There's 185 different languages spoken in the Philippines. So
That is too many. The number of languages in that country is too high.
it's very high. It's very, very high. Um, and I've been to provinces before, and I stayed months, in a cabin in the mountains with no electricity, but they weren't Tagalog speaking provinces. So like it was as much a foreign language to me as it was to the people who I was around. So I don't know, it's just a weird mix of languages that you don't get, I think, in big sort of monolithic language countries like say Japan or France or the United States. So I don't think I can answer that beyond probably not to the degree that like I feel like I got more Spanish when I lived in Mexico than I get Filipino in the Philippines.
Interesting.
When I go live in Japan, I'll let you all know.
All right.
Like,
Someone set a reminder.
yeah, just everything is a mix. I've got a box here of my pocket Wi-Fi, not pocket wife. People keep hearing pocket wife, and it's like it's the
Totally different.
it says on the front Sulit speed, which so Sulit's like enough, and Pampamilya for the family. So like that's right there. It's a mix. Speed is English. So Sulit speed Pampamilya. Right there, you got a mix of English, and then it's like Smart Bro Home Wi-Fi P995 with 10 GB data. It's just a mix. Everything's a mix. When you look at instructions, it's a mix. So it's really hard, I think, to get exposed to like just Filipino.
You
So
gotta go
like
find a real language parent.
mas
Have them
simple
adopt
na
you.
ang pag-manage ng Smart Bro Home Wi-Fi account gamit ang GigaLife app. Just like their advertisements, their instructions, everything is a mix. It's like
Sure.
if Spanglish were like the official language of Puerto Rico, maybe.
Mhm. English just ruins everything.
It does. It's so overwhelming. And English content's really good. Here lately, I've been
It is.
allowing myself English Spotify, and I'm like, wow, English just does like hard rock and heavy metal really, really well.
I don't know. I've been listening to some Spanish heavy metal. You can't tell us in Spanish, but
I don't think you can understand what any language heavy metal is in,
that's
but
the
maybe
joke.
that's just I
Skill
I know,
issue.
but like it almost makes me mad. I don't know. That's a whole different topic, but I want to understand what I'm
Next week,
What makes
3
you
rants
mad?
about metal music.
we just rants about metal. Like
This is
scream, but
actually
could you please like enunciate like what you're screaming? Like I don't mind the screaming. Just tell me what you're not any language.
this is
They're just
actually
pretending.
a good chance to mention that starting next week, we will be going into season 2 of the Refold Roundtable podcast. Some things are going to be changing. The format's going to change a little bit. How we handle questions is going to change a little bit. Going forward, we're going to have like more people to interview and go in a slightly different direction. So keep your eyes peeled for season 2 of the Refold Roundtable podcast. There probably won't be as many sort of off-topic ramble rants as there have been in this first season.
Those are
We'll
my
be a little bit more.
favorite.
They are pretty fun. They are pretty fun.
Unless you
But
comment and you say you want them. No, I'm just kidding.
We
But
should
yeah.
do there's
That's a
there's a couple
joke.
podcasts that I listen to where they make time for rants. Or, like everybody gets a rant at like a 1 minute rant at some point.
I have
I need
definitely
that.
soapboxed on the Refold Roundtable podcast before. I've
I
taken
think
like
we
a minute
all
just to
have.
rant.
I think we
Yeah, I
all
think we all
have.
have.
Yeah.
It's been our therapy at the end of the day.
Thanks for coming to my TED Talk.
Yeah, thanks for
Yes.
coming to my therapy session. Yeah, does that wrap it up today, guys?
I think so.
I think
Yeah,
that's
it was a
good.
good
So
one.
like I think just to sum it up, like, you can learn a language and internalize it to a very high degree, but maybe not to native, but that shouldn't matter. That shouldn't stop you from trying. So thank you,
The jury's
everyone.
still out on that one.
Jury's
We're gonna
out.
find out, and when we find out, we will be the first to tell you if it's actually
We
possible.
we had a podcast suggestion come in about like we should have a segment every once in a while where we just look at modern SLA research and then break it down in Refold terms. And I think that'd be really cool because, like, again, we do want to consult modern SLA practices, right? We want to be up to
You're
date
gonna have
and
to lead
be
that one.
yeah.
Have
I
you
think it'd be
listened
cool.
to the SLA podcast? Oh God, what's her name? There's a podcast where a linguistics researcher like reads a paper and then summarizes the paper in layman's terms and then gives her perspective on how the study was executed, whether she believes it, and like, what the potential biases are. It's really interesting. So if we didn't want to like go in and start reading research papers, we could just start with that podcast and like listen to her explanation and then read the same paper, and that would be a nice way to get started on that.
Yeah, I think it would.
Awesome. Well, thank you everybody for joining this week's episode of the Refold Roundtable podcast, the last episode of season 1. We're going to be bringing in the next season with some changes, like George said. So tune in for the premiere of that episode next Friday. Thank you, everyone who joined us today. If you like this episode, please let us know by dropping a like and leaving a comment below. We would love to hear from you, and we will see you next week.
Peace out, home skillets.
Peace.
Thanks for tuning in to this week's episode of the Refold Podcast. We hope you enjoyed listening and maybe even learned something new. Projects, events, and content like this podcast are only possible thanks to our generous patrons. If you liked this and want to see more similar projects, please consider supporting us on Patreon. Visit community.refold.la/Patreon-benefits to learn more.